Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
If you really want to get a handle on bioethics, you have to understand this fundamental conflict. It's right at the heart of almost every medical dilemma.
Yeah, it's like this constant tug of war, isn't it, between two really core principles.
Exactly. We're talking about beneficence versus autonomy.
Right. Beneficence, that's the doctor's side, the obligation to use their skills to help the patient to do good and, crucially, avoid harm. The classic do no harm.
And then there's autonomy. That's
Okay.
the patient's right. It's more than just choosing, though.
Oh, definitely. It's about having the rational capacity for self-governance, the ability to think things through, choose freely, act on it, without being, like, pushed into it.
And when those two collide, that's where you get paternalism.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And historically, medicine was very paternalistic. Think way back, Hippocratic tradition. The doctor was the authority figure.
The guardian.
Yeah, the guardian. Deciding what was best for the patient, often without really asking them or just getting a nod.
Thankfully, things have shifted. A lot more emphasis now on patient rights, which is why this tension is so, well, visible today.
So paternalism itself, the definition is key. Overriding someone's actions or decisions for their own good. But there's a really important ethical line drawn in the sand here.
Right, the difference between weak and strong paternalism.
Exactly. Weak paternalism is aimed at people who, for whatever reason, can't act autonomously. Their ability to choose is severely limited.
Okay, so who are we talking about?
Maybe someone dangerously psychotic or with a significant intellectual disability or someone in the grips of acute addiction. Intervening there, generally seen as acceptable.
Because the goal is protection. Or maybe even helping them get back their autonomy later.
That's the idea. But strong paternalism, that's the real ethical minefield.
That's when you override the choices of someone who is substantially autonomous. They're competent, they understand, they've made a decision.
And the doctor steps in anyway, believing they know better. It's a direct violation of that person's will.
Why is that considered such a big deal?
Because it hits right at the core of self-determination. The sources give some stark examples, like a doctor telling a patient her tumor is benign even though it's malignant.
Just because she's scared. And then urging surgery, just in case.
Yeah. Or think about the Jehovah's Witness case. She competently refuses a blood transfusion on religious grounds. She's clear about it.
Okay.
Then she falls into a coma, and the surgeons give her the transfusion anyway.
Wow. That's a direct override of a stated autonomous choice.
It is. Justified solely by the medical team thinking they know what's best for her survival, against her own deeply held beliefs.
So, philosophically, this sets up a big fight, doesn't it? Can strong paternalism ever be okay?
Right. You've got thinkers like John Stuart Mill, Alan Goldman on one side saying, basically, no, autonomy is fundamental. You're sovereign over your own life. Full stop.
The right to choose is valuable in itself, even if the choice seems unwise to others.
Precisely. That's the strong anti-paternalistic view. But then you have someone like Gerald Workin pushing back.
What's his angle?
He argues that maybe sometimes paternalism is justifiable. His reasoning is sort of interesting. He suggests rational people know they can be irrational sometimes.
Okay, like we know we might make bad decisions under pressure.
Exactly. So Dworkin says we might hypothetically agree to certain restrictions in advance, kind of like social insurance policies to protect ourselves from our future, potentially irrational self.
Like seatbelt laws. Nobody likes being told to wear one, but maybe our rational self agrees it's a good safety net against a moment of carelessness.
That's the kind of example he uses, limited state paternalism. But even Dworkin is clear. The bar for overriding someone's liberty has to be incredibly high. Authorities need a heavy and clear burden of proof.
Gotcha. So this naturally leads us into probably the most intense area where this conflict plays out. A patient's right to refuse treatment.
Especially life-saving treatment. This is where beneficence and autonomy often have a head-on collision.
And the sources point out this wasn't always a settled issue legally, was it?
Not at all. Until, the late 80s?
Yeah.
Courts sometimes did overrule patients, especially if they had kids depending on them or if they weren't considered terminally ill yet. The state's interest in preserving life often won out.
But that's changed.
Dramatically. The prevailing view now, legally and ethically, is that a competent adult has the right to refuse any medical treatment, even if it means they'll die.
And this right even extends into the future, right? Through things like advanced directives.
Absolutely. Living wills, durable power of attorney for healthcare. Ways to make your wishes known if you become incompetent later.
There's a landmark case here, isn't there? The Bouvia case.
Yes, Bouvia v. Superior Court from 1986. Elizabeth Bouvia, a really difficult situation. She was 28, mentally competent, but had severe cerebral palsy.
Quadriplegic, constant pain.
Right, and she wanted to refuse feeding through a nasogastric tube. Essentially, she was choosing to starve herself rather than continue living in that condition.
So what did the court say?
The California Court of Appeal was incredibly clear. They said she had a constitutionally guaranteed right to refuse any medical treatment, including life-sustaining care.
And the reasoning? It wasn't just about the right to refuse, was it?
No, it was heavily focused on her quality of life. The court used strong language. They called the idea of forcing her to endure 15 or 20 more years of that suffering against her will incongruous, if not monstrous.
Wow. So dignity and quality of life took precedence over just keeping her alive.
That was the crux of it. It was a massive statement affirming patient autonomy and the importance of individual values in these life and death decisions.
Okay, but what happens when the patient is a child and the parents refuse necessary life-saving treatment, maybe for religious reasons? That gets complicated fast.
Extremely complicated. The text gives the example of Ian Lundman, that 11-year-old boy who died from diabetes complications.
Because his parents were Christian Scientists and chose prayer over insulin.
Tragically, yes. And in these cases, the courts usually draw a line.
How so?
While parents have broad rights to raise their children according to their beliefs, that right isn't absolute. The courts generally rule that parents cannot cause serious harm or death to their child by withholding necessary medical care.
Because the child can't decide for themselves.
Exactly. There's that famous legal principle often quoted. Parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow they're free to make martyrs of their children. The state has a duty to protect the child's welfare.
Okay, so let's flip the script. We've talked about patients refusing care. What about the opposite? When patients or families demand treatment that doctors think is pointless.
Ah, yes, the issue of medical futility. This is a different kind of conflict.
It's not really the doctor being paternalistic now, is it?
No, it's more about the limits of medicine itself. The patient or family wants something, but the physician believes the intervention offers no real benefit or is even outside the appropriate goals of medical practice.
The classic case here is Helga Wanglie.
Right. An elderly woman, 85 years old, in a persistent vegetative state, kept alive by a ventilator.
And the doctors felt continuing this was non-beneficial, medically futile.
That was their assessment. But the family disagreed strongly. They insisted on continuing treatment based on their belief in the sanctity of life, regardless of her condition.
So the ventilator was keeping her body alive, technically. It wasn't scientifically futile in that sense.
Correct. The dispute wasn't about whether the machine worked. It was about values. What was the point of the treatment? The doctors felt it was futile because it couldn't restore consciousness, couldn't allow her to experience life in any meaningful way. It was a clash over the proper ends or goals of medicine.
So where does that leave physicians? Do they have to provide any treatment demanded? Robert Schwartz's work offers some clarity here, right? He outlines limits on autonomy.
Yes. He suggests 3 key limitations. The first 2 are fairly straightforward.
Okay.
Patients can't demand treatment using non-medical means. You can't demand your doctor prescribe a beach vacation for depression.
Makes sense. And the second?
They can't demand treatments that are scientifically futile. Things that just don't work, like laetrile for cancer or, some unproven herbal remedy.
Right. But the third limit seems the most relevant to cases like Wanglie.
Absolutely. Treatments that are inconsistent with the ends of medicine. This is where it gets philosophically interesting.
Schwartz uses that striking thought experiment, doesn't he?
The one about this patient demanding an amputation.
Yeah, a perfectly healthy limb, but they want it amputated to expiate sins.
Right. The amputation would work technically. It's not scientifically futile. But Schwartz argues the doctor isn't obligated to do it. Why? Because the request falls outside the proper scope, the healing purpose of medicine.
So it's saying doctors aren't just technicians who perform any requested procedure. They're professionals committed to certain goals: healing, restoring function, alleviating suffering.
Exactly. And providing that amputation, or arguably continuing ventilator support indefinitely for someone in a PVS state like Helga Wanglie, might fall outside those legitimate ends.
So the Wanglie physicians were essentially arguing that what they were being asked to do was like that inappropriate amputation beyond medicine's scope.
That was their ethical argument.
Ah,
Unfortunately, the legal case didn't really resolve that fundamental question about futility itself. It mostly focused on who got to decide the family in that instance.
okay, so connecting this back to broader ethical theories,
Mhm.
how do they grapple with these tensions? Utilitarianism, for instance.
Well, a straightforward utilitarian might actually justify paternalism sometimes. If lying to a patient about their diagnosis ensures they get life-saving surgery, maximizing the overall good.
Then the lie could be seen as ethical under that framework.
Potentially yes for an act utilitarian, but then you get rule utilitarians like Mill who'd argue against it.
Why?
Because having a rule that permits lying would erode trust between doctors and patients, harming the overall good in the long run. Mill's version of utilitarianism actually leans very strongly towards respecting self-determination.
And Kantian ethics, how does that fit?
Kantian ethics is generally strongly anti-paternalistic. The categorical imperative insists we treat people as ends in themselves, never merely as means.
So respecting their autonomy is paramount. Informed consent isn't just a good idea, it's morally required.
Absolutely. Deceiving a patient, even for their own supposed good, treats them as a means to a medical outcome, disrespecting their rational agency. Forbidden.
Okay, this whole evolution away from paternalism is captured nicely in those models of the patient-physician relationship by the Emanuels, right?
Yes. They lay out 4 models showing the shift. You start with the old-school paternalistic model. Physician as guardian, patient just needs to assent.
Basically, trust me, I know best.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Then comes the informative model. Here, the physician is purely a technical expert, provides all the facts, options, risks.
And the patient makes the choice, like ordering from a menu.
Sort of. Autonomy here is total control. The doctor is like a contractor executing the patient's fixed values. The interpretive model. Now, the physician is more like a counselor. The patient might have unclear or conflicting values. The doctor helps them elucidate those values, figure out what really matters to them.
So autonomy becomes more about self-understanding.
Exactly. But the Emanuels actually favor the 4th one, the deliberative model.
Deliberative, what does that entail?
Here, the physician is like a friend or teacher. They don't just present facts or clarify values. They actively engage the patient in a dialogue about health-related values.
So the doctor might actually try to persuade the patient about what's a good choice.
Yes, discuss the worthiness of different options and values. They advocate for health, but, and this is crucial, the final decision still rests with the patient. Autonomy here is seen as moral self-development through dialogue.
That sounds much more collaborative.
It aims to be. It respects autonomy, but doesn't reduce the physician to just a fact provider.
And these dynamics, these power balances and ethical roles, they don't just exist between doctors and patients, right?
Okay.
What about within the healthcare team itself? Specifically thinking about nurses.
Ah, yes. The traditional model was very hierarchical. The nurse was largely seen as subservient, implementing the doctor's orders without caution.
But that's been challenged.
Significantly, thinkers like Helga Wanglie have pushed for viewing the nurse as a patient advocate.
Meaning their primary loyalty isn't to the doctor or the hospital, but to the patient.
Precisely. This role requires nurses to be assertive, to question orders if they believe they might harm the patient or violate their autonomy. It's a fundamental shift in loyalty and responsibility.
I can see how that might cause friction, maybe in an emergency situation where speed is critical. Does the advocate role clash with efficiency?
That's the debate. Does the traditional hierarchy ensure smooth function, or does it risk patient safety and rights? The patient advocacy model argues that the potential harm from unchecked orders or rights violations is greater than any perceived loss of efficiency. It calls for a culture change, really valuing critical thinking over just following orders.
So wrapping this all up, what's the big picture from this deep dive?
Well, it seems pretty clear that clinical bioethics is fundamentally shaped by this constant, often difficult negotiation between doing good for the patient, that's beneficence.
And respecting the patient's right to decide for themselves, autonomy. It's messy.
It is messy. We've seen the law strongly protects a competent adult's right to refuse, like in the Bouvia case, even if it leads to death.
But that autonomy isn't unlimited. It bumps up against the boundaries of what's considered reasonable medical practice, as Schwartz argued with his limits, especially around futility.
Exactly. You can't demand anything just because you're autonomous. It has to align somewhat with the goals of medicine.
Okay, so for a final provocative thought, let's go back to that dialogue mentioned in the source between Dax Cowart and Robert Burt.
Ah, Dax Cowart. horrific burn injuries, excruciating pain, repeatedly demanded to refuse treatment and be allowed to die.
But he was treated against his will, and later he said he was glad he lived. It's such a complex outcome.
It is, and Bert raises this profound question. When a patient says no, especially when they're in extreme trauma, fear, or pain, does the doctor's moral duty end there?
Or, as Bert suggests, does being a compassionate fellow human almost require the doctor to engage in a deeper, maybe even confrontational dialogue? A real struggle to ensure the patient isn't making a decision solely out of temporary despair.
Is there an obligation to push, to challenge, to make sure all possibilities are truly considered before accepting that refusal?
But then, when does that compassionate engagement cross the line back into violating their autonomy, into unacceptable paternalism?
That's the razor's edge. Where is the end of the day for that conversation? How much struggle is morally permissible or even required? That boundary, it might be the hardest one to find in all of medicine. Something for you to think about.